to those of you that are newly joining us. Welcome. It's nice to virtually have you with us. Unfortunately, we can't see you in person, but hopefully soon enough. I'd like to introduce the board and speak about some of our sub-organizations as well as committees. And we will give everyone an opportunity to make a quick announcement if you are in transition looking for a job or you are aware of jobs that are available. So with that, I'd like to introduce the board: Peter Hoffman, Andrew Baum,
hello,
Michelle Bogan, Larry Slotnick, Sam Berzin. Hi, everyone. And I will start with Larry. I know you wanted to speak about the mentorship program.
Okay,
Let me unmute you and you can speak. There you go.
Thanks, Tanya. Are you hearing my audio?
Yes.
Okay, so welcome everyone. And I'm Larry Slotnick. I'm the chair of the mentorship committee, the committee that organizes the mentorship program. And we've gone through, over the course of the last 4 years, 5 different cycles of mentorship. We've grown from a group of 14 to a group of 46 over the course of the last 4 years. We're getting some validation just in terms of the headcount and the interest that we're getting from our participants. We're lucky this year that we started earlier than we did last year in terms of making arrangements. There are a lot of arrangements that need to be done in order for the mentorship program to begin properly in January. It's still our plan to begin in January, but right now we have set up the website. We now are accepting online applications that you can reach from the website, which is at jhtc.org/mentorship, or just touch the mentorship button at the top of the jhtc.org screen. So that website is up to date and very current. Our plan over the next several months is to receive the applications, do some phone screening, and make decisions, or do matching and then make decisions about who we're going to accept into the program this time. We don't generally have a lot of overage, so I would expect that nearly everyone who applies has a very good likelihood of being admitted into the program. The actual face-to-face, or not face-to-face, but the actual virtual mentorship one-on-one begins in January, and it'll run through June. So with that said, we are also beginning revisiting a program that we had 2 years ago that we call PDS, which is the Professional Developers Series. It's a series of workshops that we're providing both in career development and in job search. Oftentimes we get a lot of job search, people interested in job search in the mentor. Professional development series this year and coordinate. She survey in the coming month or so on what your interests are. But the types that we have are things like jobs, resume writing, interviewing, how to get your foot in the door, and so forth. If you're interested in pushing your resume in front of, getting it in front of the right person. And then on the side, it's more about getting the recognition that you believe you deserve and from both your boss and the community of coworkers that you work with, and how to influence. Very astute ideas about how to present yourself in a positive way that enables you to influence your coworkers. These are courses that we already have. We're looking forward through the survey and identifying other courses that you might be interested in. So I don't want to take any more time, but do visit that jht.org and then push the mentorship tab at the top, and you'll be able to read up on the program and apply if you're interested. We welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Larry. David, Sarah, would you like to talk about the Leadership Academy?
Sure. I'll start and then I'll hand it off to you, Sarah, as well. So
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be in front of you all. It's such a great group of people. People joining from all over the place. Shout out to the guy in Orlando, Florida, Florida native over here. So I'm really excited to work with Peter and Sarah and others. Can you guys hear me? I just saw a comment that
Mm-hmm.
said no audio. All right.
Yep, we can hear you.
So um, we're excited to talk about the Leadership Academy within JYA. And JYA is basically within JHTC. It's for young Jewish professionals within the Bay Area. And so what we're here doing is really creating a really top tier leadership development and training program, similar to like what we like to call as or refer to as a mini MBA program, where it's an 8-month experience where it's going to be cohort based. And we have a small group experience as well, where we're actually able to pull together a lot of different amazing speakers are able to, share some knowledge. These speakers are leadership coaches, business executives from both the for-profit and nonprofit sectors. Some of them are tech executives as well. And we're able to, take the learnings from these amazing speakers and actually apply them in our small groups within the community itself. And again, Sarah, I'll let you give a quick update on that. But again, before I do hand it off officially, this is open to our selection criteria is basically post-grad to around mid-30s, early 30s. So early career professionals really trying to level up both personally and professionally, trying to really take that next level within the networking realm, within the Bay Area, within other people, within our own cohort, within our speakers, and also just getting more involved within the Jewish community here as well. And so the applications are due on the 16th. And there you can go to our website. I'll post the website in the comments as well. And then again, please share it with other people. I realize that a lot of people here on the call, this might not be super applicable to. However, you guys might know other people, friends, family, and or other people who might be interested in a leadership development program targeted towards early career and young professionals, specifically, ideally, us in the Jewish community. So Sarah's one of our assistant directors of the program, and she's leading some of these activities, specifically the small groups as well. So Sarah, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And David, thanks so much for the introduction there. I think you did a great job covering a lot of the program. So with the small group, it's a really great highlight of the program, really cornerstone. So this is groups of 4 to 5 individuals who are in the program, who are able to contribute back to the Jewish community, as well as through the length of the program of 8 months, be working together. And starting out with introspection as far as leadership skills, and then as you get towards the winter spring time frame for the program, these groups end up working together and helping the Jewish community. And we're also currently accepting proposals as well for different community projects. So we've got an incredible set of speakers lined up, courtesy of the Great Steering Committee and beyond who worked on this. So some of those folks include Arnon Gashuri, who's the CPO of Luongo, who may sound familiar to those of you who are on the last call. And then we've also recently signed on Shlomi Kaufman, who's the Israeli Consul General. And we've got a couple others as well throughout tech, Ira Ehrenpreis, as well as Beth Loeb Davies. So definitely check out our website for a full list. Noah Alpers is also on there, founder of Noah's Bagels. Great, great list. Check it out. And if you guys have any questions, or if anyone would like to join the program, definitely have them reach out to David or myself, and we would be happy to answer them. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tanya, I think.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes. And it looks like Andrew is not on, but I can say a few words about JYA. It's an organization that's been a part of JHTC for a few years now, and it's for young adults. And Andrew Gelman is leading that. Peter is mentoring. If you'd like, Peter, if you'd like to say anything in regards to that, that'd be great. If not, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us.
Sure, Tanya, I'll just add that the JWA does there's 6 members of the executive committee. They do a monthly, virtual event, right? We're in a virtual world these days. If you want more information, there's a Facebook JYA page, and go there. If you have questions, you can privately message myself, David, or if there's some other people from JYA, but happy to tell you more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And with that, I will hand it over to Andrew to introduce our speaker for tonight, Andrew Baum.
Thank you, Tanya. Pleasure to have everybody here. It's really my true honor and privilege to introduce Chris MacAskill. I consider him a friend and a mentor. I worked with Chris at SmugMug. He hired me there, and I think he's just a wonderful person and a great storyteller. He is the co-founder of Cake.com and CEO, which is an exciting new platform where you create conversations that are unique to interests. The idea from Cake.co came from his own personal experience with another startup he did called Adventure Rider, which is a community for aggressive motorcycle riders. A very popular motorcycle forum with millions of monthly views that he founded for fun and has run for over 20 years. At Cake.co, it's an answer to the community's yearning for a much better place and experience to share their special conversations surrounding their unique interests. And this is a great place to do that. Chris started basically Cake.co and has co-founded it. He also co-founded SmugMug and was president there for 15 years, which SmugMug recently acquired Flickr, and is possibly one of the last profitable independent photo sharing companies still in the world. Prior to SmugMug, Chris founded FatBrain, and he grew that from basically zero in revenue to 100 million in 4 years, and took it public on NASDAQ, and it was acquired by Barnes & Noble after that. This was at a time when people didn't take Amazon seriously, so he was very successful there. Chris is he's a visionary, he's an adventurist, he's a fitness he's an enthusiast, he's a successful entrepreneur, athlete, animal lover. He's a character in his own right. Silicon Valley legend as far as I'm concerned. He's interacted with some of the best, Steve, Jeff. Worked with Pixar, Next, General Magic, and he grew up in Oakland. And prior to coming into the technology, he was a geophysicist, and he traveled throughout the world. So Chris is going to share some personal stories, and we'll give time for a Q&A post. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll do a Q&A after his storytelling, his great storytelling. I want to have everybody fully engaged and enjoy Chris for all he's worth. So I'm going to throw it over to Chris. Thanks for being here. Let's give him a really warm virtual welcome. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm not worthy of that intro. Thank you, but I'm going to share my screen. I have photos to go along with some of the things I'm going to say. So host disabled screen sharing. I'm getting a message. Can you authorize me? Ah, there we go. Somebody push the right button.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So imagine you're a geophysicist, an earth scientist, which you've dreamed of being for a long time, and you've been in the business for 10 years. You spent 6 years getting an education in it, and it's this adventurous thing where you get to travel all around the world. It's taken me to throughout the Middle East, Israel included, and studying earthquakes there. You get to fly in helicopters, you get to do all these wonderful things, and then you're in a bookstore, and that was a slow switch. You're in a bookstore, and by serendipity, pure serendipity, this book catches your eye. This was me at age 36, written by Guy Kawasaki when he was a young evangelist, was his official title at Apple. And he was trying to get people to write software for the Macintosh, this new computer, and he wrote a book about it. And, you know, I love geophysics, but I picked up that book in Calgary Airport and read it all the way to my home in Houston, and just got completely engrossed by the stories. And at the same time, my seventh grader son, Don, who now runs SmugMug and Flickr, he got this book to do a book report in Houston public schools. All the other boys were giving talks on football players and presidents, and my geeky son, Don, went up and gave a talk on his hero, which remains has always been his hero, Steve Jobs. It wasn't the most complimentary book of Steve, and Steve hated it, but Don loved it. And afterwards, sometime, I can't keep track of the time exactly, but he held a family caucus with my wife and I and our 4 kids, and said, Papa, why don't you go to work in the computer industry? We can relate to that a lot more than all this high risk geophysics that takes you away and puts you at risk. And you could go work for Steve Jobs. That'd be the coolest thing ever. So I tried to explain to him sitting in Houston that, well, I'm going to turn 40 pretty soon, and mortgage on the home, and 16 years in geophysics. Is he really going to hire a geophysicist? And but this quote that Steve made, I'm a little laggy here in terms of, there we go, changing slides, and that Steve made much later, just fit me to a T. Staying hungry, wanting adventure. Adventure has always, our family motto has been never a dull moment. And stay foolish. Well, one of the most foolish things I could think of doing was abandoning my career as a vice president of R&D at a big prestigious geophysical company, leaving it all behind, loading up a U-Haul truck and driving all the way to California, renting a home in Mountain View, and saying, here I am, world. I'm applying for a job now. But I did it because foolishness. So waiting for this slide. And somehow, through a miracle, I got hired at Next. And it's where I wanted to work. Next was the company that Steve started after leaving Apple. And he took 8 people with him, prominent people from Apple. And the idea was simple. It was Unix, which all scientists love. I was a scientist, so I loved Unix, with a graphical user interface. Well, that sounds like, what the world needs now. So I ended up there. Last fall, I got asked to give a TEDx talk, mostly on my experiences, I thought, in working in Silicon Valley, and some of these stories I have to tell over lunch that I've never really spoken about publicly that much. And when we did the rehearsals, they put you through a lot of rehearsals. Somebody asked, well, what's your background? How'd you, what influenced you to be so crazy? And so I told them a little bit about my background, and a couple of the listeners in the audience said, that's what you got to talk about. You have to talk about what shaped you and what led up to this. The story isn't complete without that. Well, I don't really like to talk about that. And you don't really do a TED Talk on yourself, do you? So is that really a good idea? So I came up with a compromise with them, which was to, now how did that happen? So I came up with a compromise, which was to open with some of my background and then spend the last half of the talk telling Steve's stories. So I'm going to do that today also, only it won't be quite as much proportion of the talk on my own personal story. And the Steve stories I have to tell are not what I told in the TED Talk. In fact, some of them I've just never really told to anybody except a few friends over lunch. But they changed the world, and it was amazing to be there as an eyewitness to it. We didn't talk about them in the day because they were too embarrassing. But looking back on them, they just seem epic. So my personal story came from, of course, my parents. That's my mom, who married a handsome lieutenant in the Canadian Navy. Glowing on the day, she went on to become runner-up for homecoming queen at USC and to get a master's degree in organic chemistry from Cornell and follow her dream career into cancer research. And she had 2 little girls, my older sisters. And then something started to happen around her mid-30s, and she seemed to get drawn to conspiracy theories. It was kind of an understandable time because there was a Senator, Joseph McCarthy, who was scaring the nation about the communists and they're bugging our telephone lines and all that. And she believed it. And so I don't think my grandparents realized that this was the onset of a mental illness, but it turned out to be paranoid schizophrenia. And by the time and so she left my father, we went to live with my grandparents. And by the time I was 4, she had to be committed to what was then called an insane asylum in Sarah, Pennsylvania. And sometimes I got to visit with her on weekends when she was well enough to come to the house. This is a photo my grandfather took of us. I was probably 6 years old at the time. She seemed cheerful. We always had an extremely close relationship. I adored her all my life. And I don't remember ever having arguments with her, despite everything that we went through. So somehow the family history is blank on this, but somehow she got out of her insane asylum and drove an old car to Oakland and got a terrible apartment in a terrible section of town and sent a telegraph to my grandparents and said, send Christopher. And I was 7 years old. So they took me down and bought me a suit because that's the way you traveled in the day. And they made arrangements with TWA to have the stewardesses, as they were called, watch over me and make sure I got a connection in Chicago to San Francisco, and I flew alone. And the stewardesses were wonderful. They pinned wings on my suit jacket, and I got to sit up in the cockpit with the pilots and talk to them while we were flying. So, so that part of the trip was pretty awesome. But then when I got to San Francisco, she didn't pick me up. And so I was in the airport just crying my eyes out. And I can remember, I mean, they took good care of me, but I'd hear the, you know, Miriam MacAskill, please come to the white courtesy telephone all the time. And eventually my father came and got me. I was afraid of him. I'd only met him twice. He was a big heavyweight boxer, deep voice. And one of the times we'd met when I was 5, he spun me around with all good intentions and my arm dislocated and I had to go to the hospital. So I was terrified of him. So I moved in with my mom. I got to go to 2nd grade in a school on MacArthur Boulevard that had only one other white child at the time. I never got to meet him. And so all my friends were black, and it was cool. I could play baseball in the street and they could too. And that's all you needed to do to be accepted in the community. And life was pretty happy for that year, for 2nd grade. But mom's disease got worse and she got all kinds of substance abuse. She started smoking heavily, and we get a $250 alimony. And the first day we got it, it would go to like 5ths of rum and things like that. And she'd get drunk, and we lost our apartment. And so we went to live on the street. You wouldn't think it could happen to a 3rd grade child, but it happened to us. My mom, I knew she believed a lot of things that weren't true. That was obvious. But there was one thing she believed and told me that sounded like it could be true. And that was, if the truant officer ever caught me playing hooky from school, I would go to San Quentin prison for life. And I didn't know where that was, but it didn't sound like anything. I mean, it just sounded scary as can be. So the other thing is when we were walking along the street, she claimed to have memorized the complete works of Shakespeare. And you think your parents embarrassed you? I'd walk a block behind her. I had to keep track of her because she's the only person in the world that I knew. And I mean, she meant everything. But on the other hand, schizophrenics can create quite a disturbance and be loud. And she was very loud as she was belting out Shakespeare. And it was day after day. And we ate I shoplifted a little bit. I didn't think of it as a crime. I just thought of it as I don't have money to pay, so I need to take this. And I got pretty sneaky about it. And I feel sorry now for the shop holders who would have somebody like me come in and steal a can of SpaghettiOs or whatever. So the one thing I couldn't do is steal any cigarettes from mom, and we didn't have any money for any cigarettes. So one of my chores was walking down the streets, it seemed like hours to me, with a brown paper bag, picking up cigarette butts off the street and taking to my mom every day. And we lived in boxcars and parks and creek beds and under freeway bridges with other homeless people. Many, probably half of them, had schizophrenia themselves or some kind of drug addiction or something like that. And one of the laws in California, that may be why she came here, there's fairly liberal laws that say if a policeman recognizes you as mentally ill, they take you to a psych ward, and then they have 72 hours to treat you. And if I assume everybody is still hearing me, right? I'm still live?
Yes.
Everybody seems frozen.
Yes, I hear you.
Okay, so I hope I wasn't talking to myself. So they can detain you for 72 hours, but if you don't pose a threat to society, you have to be released. So mom would go around away umpteen times. I don't know how many times she was taken away by police for 72 hours, and I'd stay with other homeless people, and they were all extremely nice. And they just had, wild beliefs about things. I'm not sure when it happened, probably very close to 6th grade. I finally got caught shoplifting, and this time it was serious. It was a sweater in a department store in Oakland. I always had an escape route. My instincts were to run. If I saw a policeman, I avoided him. He could be a truant officer. I just ran from everything. It just became my life. And so on the 4th floor, when I was getting in the elevator and I could see the clerk noticed I had a sweatshirt or a sweater in my jacket, I had my escape route. I went down to the 2nd floor and got on one of those iron fire escapes and jumped down to the sidewalk. But a store detective came around the corner in full stride, fast dude. And so I took off to Lake Merritt at the long run for, I don't know, 5th grader, 6th grader. And, you know, he caught me. And he caught me right at the edge of Lake Merritt, and there was a cement wall there. And I remember he turned me against the wall, pounded my back against the wall. My head hit the wall several times. And he said, "You little," I've got my wife upstairs saying, "I don't like it when you use colorful language." So you'll let you use your imagination on what he said. And they hauled me back in and did mugshots and fingerprints and put me in a cell. And the next day I went here to the Oakland Juvenile Hall. And at that point, you know, I had no way to get hold of my dad. I didn't even really know where he lived. I was a little bit afraid of him. I couldn't communicate with my mom. She probably thought the communists finally got me. But some tall, silver-haired man would keep coming into my cell and bring me books. And he was very kind. And he would sit beside me and say, "Son, we need to know who you are so we can help you." And I wouldn't tell him. I'd look at my feet and just freeze. I wasn't going to tell anybody because I'm going to San Quentin if I do, because they'll find out I missed all that school. So he said, "We're going to have to appear in court, and the judge is going to demand you tell who you are, and you won't be able to tell him no." So the courthouse was so intimidating. I've never been back in a courthouse. And I tell myself, I could do it. Sure, I could do it. But when I pass one, I get this feeling in my stomach like, oh no. So we went to court twice, as I remember. I thought the judge was Darth Vader before Darth Vader was a thing. Black cape and deep voice and hammer he pounded on the desk with, and he would demand that I identify myself, and I wouldn't. So this kind, silver-haired man, I'd love to talk to his family and thank them for all that he did, would put his arm around me while I would shake, and then eventually my bladder burst. I thought I would never get over that. I thought that was the most humiliating thing ever, and they led me out of court. And after that, I don't remember anything. I don't remember how I got out. I just don't remember anything. And I never told anybody, not until the last, 10 years or so, that my bladder burst in court, because that's the most humiliating thing that could ever happen to somebody. So maybe, my mom called my dad. I don't know. This is my father and his new wife, Julie, my stepmom. And they took custody of me, and I went over the hill to live in Orinda, just over the hills from Oakland, into an all-white upper middle class neighborhood. And I didn't speak or fit in, with any of those kids, because it is not the way I had been living. And she had never been married before. She got married in her late 40s. She was an actress, and she hadn't been around kids much. And also one of my sisters, Jane, who had been living with my dad all this time, was in the house too. And I started the 3rd week of 6th grade from there. And when I walked in that 6th grade class and they were doing times tables, I could listen to those kids rattle off 7 times 8 is 56 and all that. And I'd think, what in the world are they doing? I don't get it. And so eventually the teacher, Mrs. Givens, asked me to come to the board and diagram a sentence. I'd never heard of such a thing. Well, what are you talking about? Diagram a sentence. So I drew a box around it, and class started laughing, and I did what I always did. I ran. When you're a kid growing up in the streets, you can't have any self-esteem, and I ran. And I always had my escape routes, so I ran out into the creek and down the creek and into a drainage culvert, and I stayed there all day and thought about what to do. I was never going back to that class, I can tell you that. And what if the principal or somebody, a teacher, called my dad and he beats me up or something? And I think I contemplated seriously just going over the hill back to Oakland, and no one would ever find me. I could just disappear into the hill. I knew how to survive in Oakland. That would have changed the course of my life. I'm not sure exactly why I didn't, but I decided to go home with an escape route. I thought I could outrun my dad, I guess. And I think I did it because I think my mom would have heard. She got committed to another institution, and I think she would have heard that I was missing. I visited her every Saturday. Julie loaded me on a Greyhound bus to visit her. And then she would think the communists had gotten me, and she would be heartbroken. So I went back to try to go home. And when I went home, Julie just dropped down on her knees and wrapped her arm around me and let me sob uncontrollably. And I never had to tell them what happened. But when I went back to school the next day, which I was pretty reluctant to do, they said I didn't have to go back to that classroom. Two angels who I guess were in special ed, the women spent all day with me, and they had me do all kinds of things like cut folded pieces of paper and unfold them and see what the patterns were, predict what the patterns were. And when I got home, my sister Jane said, yeah, that was an IQ test. And Dad said, you have a very low IQ. Well, I didn't know what that meant, but it was low, so whatever. I struggled, I was in all the slow learning classes in 6th grade. My nickname was a retard. The TEDx people didn't let me say that. Barely made it through junior high. But in high school, there was a freshman high school teacher who'd had his face burned off in a chemical accident, and he was always all scarred, and all the kids made fun of him. But I identified with him, and he and I bonded. I don't know why people like this aren't our national heroes. They ought to be. And he convinced me I could do math and science. And so I did. Mr. Davis and I just, I thought, wow, there's a whole new world. I can do this. The problem was in English, sophomore English, they pulled out Shakespeare. I got a lot of laughs when I was at TEDx, but for me, it was serious. The thing was, I just couldn't bring myself to be around, I'd la, 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 I wouldn't listen. I just, I had to miss class or something. I couldn't do my homework. I just was not going to go to Shakespeare. I just couldn't. And I couldn't tell the school counselors or anybody else because I didn't want to go to San Quentin or make up, all those years. So I just never told anybody. My mom never told anybody. And so when I graduated from high school, I had D's in English and A's and B's and everything else, mostly A's. And the UC system will let you in with D's in English only if you agree that you're going to take Bonehead English, English 1A, and you can pass it. So I took it the first quarter and I got an F because I pulled out Shakespeare. And I took it the second quarter, I got an F again. And I couldn't tell my counselor why I was getting A's in, computer science and math and physics and all that, but I was getting F's in English. She said, nobody gets F's in Bonehead English. So they let me take it correspondence from UC Berkeley. Pass, no pass. She said, everybody passes. And I got a no pass. And I was out of the university. I was expelled. And I thought it was the most unfair thing in my life. So, and I was, really angry. And I swore I would never step foot on another college campus as long as I lived. But I did have a job at a summer camp. And when I went to the summer camp, there was this girl. And I met her the first night I was there. And something about her I just completely fell head over heels. And so I took photos. I took this photo of her riding horses. We were inseparable for the summer, for the 10 weeks of the summer. We always had 10 kids around us because it was a summer camp. We rode horses, we did kayaks and all that kind of stuff. But I heard after the first few days that she'd already graduated from college and something about honor society. And I just thought, oh no, as soon as she hears that I'm an idiot and I got expelled and I'm never going back, this isn't going to work. Not going to work. But as it turns out, towards the end of the summer, I had never told anybody, not my dad, stepmom, nobody, about what had happened. And towards the end of the summer, I had to tell this girl a few things. She was going to come meet my parents. I had to tell her my mom was mentally ill and that my dad was mad at me because I flunked out of Santa Barbara and he wouldn't pay for any more college. And anyway, I didn't want to go back to college. And I thought we would go our separate ways and she would leave me, but she didn't. She came with me. There she is. And we ended up getting married. I was 19 when I sort of proposed. Maybe she's going to laugh upstairs when she hears that. And 20 when I got married. And this is what she looks like today with some of our grandkids. And there would be one person on this earth that could convince me to go back to college, and it was her. And after a year of working as a scab at a Teamsters and warehouse in Oakland, she convinced me to go to University of Utah. and promised to tutor me in English. And we found a way to kind of skirt the system by signing up for things like technical writing. And there was a guy, a professor there of higher education, who gave a talk, and he boomed over the microphone that IQ test is the biggest fraud that's ever been perpetrated on the American public. It measures interest and exposure, and that's all. And if you want to, and he had me at IQ, I'll tell you. And he gave this method for learning, which was go to the same place, the same time every day. Don't eat there, don't nap there, don't get distracted there. If you do lose your concentration, get up and walk away. And after a few weeks, you will learn immersive concentration. And I promise you, you'll graduate in the top 2% of your graduating class. Well, I had a little secret that I don't think I told Tony, which is my mom always said her dream for me was to go to a graduate school like she did. And she went to Cornell. And so I started dreaming of Oxford. I don't know why Oxford, it just sounded, you know, and I don't know if I even told Tony, but I just dreamed of Oxford. And when I got to be a senior, we were so poor. We'd had a child along the way, and I was working 3 a.m. to 8 a.m. at United Parcel Service to pay our way. Tony decided we had $25 to apply to one college for graduate school. So I went to the college catalogs, got to O, and it was 50. And not only that, there was some L in front of it with a funny line through it. I didn't know what that meant. And also it was in England. Who knew that? It's like my dream is shattered. 4 years of dreaming of going to Oxford, my dream is shattered. I don't have 50. Are any other schools 25? So I kept going down the alphabet and picked out the catalog for Stanford, and it was 25. I was so bad at English still that when the Stanford application said write a statement, I took that to be a sentence. So the whole page, I turned the IBM selectric to the middle of the page and wrote one sentence on why I thought I was qualified for Stanford. Embarrassing. But amazingly enough, I got accepted, and not only did I get accepted, I got accepted by this guy who was the Dean of Earth Sciences and the most famous geophysicist ever. If there would have been a Nobel Prize for geophysics, he would have won 2 of them. And he wanted to see me in his office on the first day, and I was terrified. Thought he was going to tell me there was a mistake. So I put my acceptance letter in my top pocket, walked into his office with Dawn on my shoulders, who was a couple years old by then, just for cuteness and to relax and have something I could fidget with. He said, he stuttered, he said, Chris, can you tell me, what is this achievement score you had in reading comprehension, English, whatever it is for graduate school? I got 99th percentile in everything but that, and I got 33rd in that. And so I nervously laughed and said, I don't do English sentences. I do equations. That's why I chose geophysics. I wanted to get as far away from English as I possibly could. I never want to, see another English class in my life. And he put down his reading glasses and the file and looked very serious and said, well, I have bad news for you. And I knew what he was going to say, and the blood was draining out of my body. He was going to say, they're retracting the admission. He said, in order to become a great scientist, you must first become a great writer, because what does it mean to do good science if you can't write about it? Because then no one will know about it. You have 2 years here to get your master's thesis. You have to write it, and I'm going to grade it, and it better be good writing or you're not going to pass. And I thought, well, okay, then I'm not going to pass. And I was fighting back tears, and I took Dawn and walked around the quad for 2 hours and thought about how tough my life was and put my lower lip out. By the way, the first time I ever stepped on Stanford campus, I made a vow to myself that I would bend down and kiss the earth. And I would appreciate being there more than any student ever had in the 100 previous years at Stanford. And I've done that every single time I've gone back. Maybe not virtually, or maybe not physically kiss the ground, but virtually. I always do that. And I thought I, would show them all that, I appreciated being there more than anyone else. And I was the only one accepted in the program from a state university. Everybody else came from Harvard or Cambridge or something. But I thought of Paul Dunn, the guy who gave the talk at the University of Utah, and I thought, well, here's what I'll do. I can't go back to take an English class. They're going to pull out Shakespeare and I'll flunk it. So what I'll do is I'll spend 2 hours a day, same time, same place, 6 days a week, do what they told me to do, and I will hold my nose and try to learn to like English as if it's like trying to learn how to like canned asparagus or something. but I'm going to do it on my own terms, and I'm going to pick the writers that I study, and I'm not studying any Shakespeare. And so that turned out to be Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill and Mark Twain and Pascal. And after 6 months, I started to really love it, and I started to totally get into it. And I remember so many things. The difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. Abraham Lincoln wrote this letter to a friend that never made any kind of headlines at all, but I was really struck by this. He said, I would give all that I own and go into debt to write so fine a piece as I think that is, referring to a play that was very depressing. Pascal wrote something, I've modified this a little bit. He wrote something, I'm sorry to have written a 5-page letter. I didn't have time to write a 1-page letter. And those have always stuck with me. So when I wrote my master's thesis, Alan wrote a little note saying, good job, and he gave me an A-. And I thought, wow, my life is complete. And off I went to be a geophysicist. But there was one stop first. I almost forgot this, and it's one of the most important things. One of the biggest donors of the university was a geophysicist, and they decided to throw a banquet in his honor. He was very old, 90 or something. And they had 10 distinguished speakers, including George Shultz, who was the future Secretary of State, and CEOs of all these companies. And they decided to have, the president of the university spoke, they decided to have a student give the concluding talk, and they picked me. And I don't think I've ever been so terrified in my life, but they picked me in April and the talk was in October. So I had all that time to practice speaking to cans and trees and parked cars and everything else. And that was the first time in my life I decided, you know what, I think they deserve to know why I appreciated this university more than any student they've ever had here. That's why they picked me after all, because I couldn't believe my fortune in being there. I would pinch myself every day, and every minute I would be there when the other students were complaining about the workload, quality of instruction, food, you name it. They were complaining about everything. I complained about nothing, because it's like, wow, just being here is, I snuck in. If they knew who I was, I wouldn't be here. So in the first of my 10-minute talk, for the first 3 or 4 minutes, I started to talk about what I just told you. And you could hear a pin drop in the audience, and I misjudged what that was. I thought it was awkward, and that I was saying something I shouldn't say, and that I should stick to. Unfortunately, in my back pocket, I had another talk in case that happened. And so after 4 minutes, I transitioned away from it and tried not to die up on the podium, but I was dying inside. And I can't remember the last 6 minutes of the talk. I was so nervous. I had to have my wife, Tony, sit outside. I couldn't have her in there. I couldn't have anybody who knew me be in there because I was too afraid I'd be humiliated. And I got humiliated. So I went out and grabbed Tony and did what I always did. I ran, and I started to run across campus. Well, I couldn't really run so much holding Tony's hand, but we walked fast. And one of the executives chased us down with his wife and stopped me and asked where I was going after, I graduated. And I said to Chevron, I had their scholarship. And he said, well, they will train you to be head of a department. We'll train you to be CEO of the company. It's like, what'd you just say? And will you sit by us tonight at the banquet? And will you fly down to Houston and give us a chance, to hire you and all that? And it's like, what is happening here? I just made a fool of myself. This is the craziest thing that's ever happened in my life. But we did it. And that's the company that I joined. And he changed my life. And for 10 years, he was a great mentor. And that was one of the greatest lessons in my life, that some of these stories that seem completely humiliating are important and people can relate to them. So back to completely humiliating stories. My first is with Ross Perot. He was a giant of the industry when I first got to Next, and he was about to run for president. And he and Steve somehow formed this odd couple, strange relationship. Ross was always dressed in a pinstripe suit with tightly cropped hair, lace-up shoes, spit polished. No other shoes would do. You weren't allowed to wear loafers in his organization. And Steve was, like totally the opposite. And yet they hit it off. Ross had watched a documentary. Is it true that he was leading in the polls for a while? Ross had watched the documentary called The Entrepreneurs and was so impressed by Steve that he invested $20 million in us and said it was the safest investment he'd ever made in his life. Well, one of my first things to do was to do a developer conference. I was an evangelist. I had become Guy Kawasaki for Next, trying to convince people to write software for the platform. All the bigs like Bill Gates and Larry Ellison and all those. And so we threw a developer conference in a venue that Steve would respect, which was the Davies Symphony Hall. And we hired the comedians Penn and Teller, magicians, to perform for the audience. And Ross came out for it. And I was a little starstruck, and I would see Steve and Ross walking around. It was amazing to be an evangelist because, although we called them advocates, because evangelist was offensive to some people. That word was like the lightning bug. Anyway, so in the middle of Penn and Teller's act, where they had a wooden dummy on the stage and everything was going well, Steve wandered in with Ross. And so I jumped up on the stage and said, "Would you like to hear from Steve?" And of course, everybody was crazy about that idea. So Steve got up and started talking to them, and he was the master of all storytellers. There's just never been anybody like him in the computer industry. I don't know when we ever will get one like that again. And then he called on Ross to come up there, and I thought, man, I hate this about Steve, that he gets these people who can't speak like he can speak and makes them look terrible. And maybe he likes the contrast or something. But Ross hopped up on the stage, and oh my gosh, he could light it up just like Steve could. And the first thing he did that just brought the roof down was he looked at that dummy and he said, "You look like some of the directors I serve with at General Motors." It was, this big story that General Motors had bought his company for billions or something. And he was on the board, and he was an unhappy board member. So he was squawking to the press, and yeah, everybody just laughed at that, and they thought it was the greatest thing ever. Well, it turns out that Steve had done a deal with IBM to license our operating system with IBM. How that unlikely deal happened was amazing, but it was my gateway to talk to Ross, because Ross used to be a salesman for IBM. And so the way that it worked, Steve told me, is he was invited to Ronald Reagan's birthday party, I think in his late 20s or early 30s. And he was quite impressed that they had a red carpet leading up to the entrance and a line of trumpeters with long trumpets that trumpeted every person's entrance. And when he stepped up through the door, there was Reagan himself greeting Steve. And John Akers, I think it was, who was the CEO of IBM at the time, was at the party. And President Reagan said, "Here, I have somebody for you to meet, to talk to." So Steve goes up to John Akers, chairman of one of the most powerful companies and most respected companies on earth, and does what Steve always does, is a modus operandi, which was to say, "Oh, your technology is just really sucks, compared to ours. We're reinventing computing, and that's going to put you in a very bad situation." And John Akers, being gracious, said, "Well, maybe we should work together." And so Steve did this huge deal with them to license our operating system to them. But they were putting it on their workstation. Steve didn't like that. He wanted this to be a mass appeal operating system, and they looked at it as Unix. No, this is for engineers and scientists. And so he didn't like it, and the relationship got very strained. And a lot of people at Next were coming to me saying, "You're in charge of this relationship, fix it." And I didn't know how to fix it. So I decided I'm going to pick up the phone and dial 1-800-ROSS-PRO. And I got his assistant, Tom Walter, who's 6'4" and has a sculpted face and a very deep voice and a slow Texas drawl. And people had warned me about him. They said, "He's a nice guy. Don't be intimidated, but you're going to think he's Darth Vader." That's how we refer to him around here. He's seriously intimidating. So I told Tom Walter, "I'm going to get fired by Steve if he knows I made this phone call. But I think Ross is the one person on earth who can talk Steve into the benefits of this IBM relationship. And we really need this." He said, "I'll talk to Ross." I'm like, "Well, Chris, I'll talk to Ross about it." And so he went and talked to Ross, and he called me back several times and said that Ross is up for it. We have a board meeting coming up next week. He'll be at the board meeting, and so will I, and we'll bring it up, but it's the number 2 item on his list, not the number 1 item. And he didn't tell me what the number 1 item is. He said, but he was sure we'd get to it. So I was nervous. Steve wanted in my office a few days later and said, hey, there's a board meeting next week. Would you help me set it up? And I thought, oh, he knows. What? And I had to set up these 4 computers for Steve. We had a new color workstation out, the whole thing, so he could demo, like, you know, he's the best demo on earth. And so I set up the whole board meeting, but I wasn't invited into the board meeting itself. Everything at Next was glass, so you could see and everything. And of course, we all were stealing glances over there. And I had, you know, had helped Steve with several of his keynotes, so I knew how to set up his computer and all the things that he liked and what was going to crash and what wasn't, and told him to watch out for, you know, avoid this menu item and so on. So Ross and Tom showed up. Ross must be 5'2", or must have been 5'2" or something. He wore flats, you know, to give him an extra inch. And Tom is 6'4". And they just look like the odd couple. And they go into the conference room. Ross stops and greets everybody. He's, you know, Mr. Everyman. And I got to shake his hand, and he goes in the conference room, and Steve sets about demoing for 20 minutes. And we have this new finder basically for the next machine. And he's demoing that, and he's demoing the color. It's 12 bits. It's not 8-bit. You know, that would be lame. And after 20 minutes, Ross held out his hand and said, I believe you, Steve. I believe you. You got the best computer on the planet. I know that. And Suns are total crap. It's the worst computer on the planet, just like you say it is, Steve. I believe it. You don't need a demo to me anymore. I know. It turns out Ross was non-technical, so he didn't really, his eyes were glazing anyway. So he said, Steve, I only have one question for you. Their sales curve looks like that. And he showed an arm pitched at 45 degrees. And our sales curve looks like that. And he showed a flat curve. And he says, now, I've been thinking about this, Steve, and it seems like there's 1 or 2 things it could be. And he spoke very fast as Steve. He was the only guy who had a clock speed equal to Steve's. And he said, there, that man, and he's pointing to our vice president of sales, that man can't sell a computer. And that man was going ashen about then. Or there's something we don't know about our computer that's wrong with it, and we need to find out. Why don't we call some customers and say, hey, if you ain't buying, why aren't you buying? Tell me why you ain't buying, I'll fix it, and then you can buy it. Ain't it that simple, Steve? I've asked people when I've told this story over lunch a couple of times, what do you think Steve did? And no one can ever answer. And what he did is he got up and he walked out, and he went to his office, which was next to it, separated by a glass wall so everybody could see what he's doing. He sat down at his next machine and started doing email. And Ross said, did the CEO of this company just leave this meeting? Is he coming back? I mean, what's going on here? And as his fuse was starting to blow, Tom Walter was trying to settle him down. Oh, Ross, let's give the boy some time. I'm sure he'll be back. He's got my $20 million. What did you walk out at me? I asked a simple question. I want a simple answer. Why didn't he have blah, blah, blah? And so Ross had a cardinal rule was you go on board meetings to fight. But when you come out, even if you disagree, you agree, you know, you're on board. And he came out fuming. He grabbed his briefcase and stormed out with Tom trying to talk him out of it. A lot of people around watching this, and he was just muttering, you know, he took my $20 million. Now you won't answer my question. Why am I even on the board meeting if I can't? And there was a young 23-year-old, very kind marketing person who was brand new at Next. And she looked pretty shocked to see this famous person going off on Steve like that. And Ross suddenly realized what he was doing. I'll never forget this. Realized what he was doing and stopped and started stuttering and saying, yeah, well, that man, he pointed towards Steve's office. That man changed the world. Don't forget that. There ain't many men who could say that. And off he stormed down the stairs to his private jet at the Palo Alto airport. And I don't think he ever came back. I don't think they ever spoke again. Now, I know that's a little bit of a depressing story. Now you understand why you've never heard it, because we would never tell anything like that. It was embarrassing, but it was kind of, you know, a frequent sort of thing. And one of the reasons I tell it is because the story I'm going to close on ties into that perfectly. That was the board room, by the way, and that was our new computer that we were, and maybe I took that photo. All the details I noticed, like these shirts. Steve went to the Uffizi in Italy for a week because he loved that. And and he ordered 200 of those custom shirts. I was there on a Saturday. I had to receive them because he wanted a fresh one every day. Looked a little like the Mac, huh? So beautiful interface. So the next story I'm going to tell, I'll come back to that Ross Pro story at the end. The next story I'm going to tell is astonishing. I don't think anybody knows about this story, and I think this story changed the world. So Steve would invite me to these various meetings. It would be just Steve and I. I don't know why. I think he just, thought I had to do with relationship building, with third parties and so on. And one of those was with George Fisher, and he was famous because he was from a gold-plated company. Motorola was so respected in the day, and he was a gold-plated executive at Motorola, an industry rock star, and he came out to tell us some news. And the news that he had for us is that the microprocessor we were using was at the end of the line. It was 33 megahertz. They couldn't conceive of going faster than 50 megahertz and cooling that chip. And we had to switch to another kind of chip, a so-called RISC chip, a reduced instruction set chip. And that was going to require all kinds of software that we had to write and porting over to the chip's instruction set. And I didn't say much in those meetings, but I remember, wanting to know who else is doing this. Well, Apple had bought into it. There were a few other companies like Data General who bought into it, but it wasn't a long list of who's who, had bought into this. And I got sick to my stomach because I had all these developers who were now, they were distributing their software on a whole stack of floppy drives. Now they'd have to have a second stack of floppy drives, and they'd have to have 2 code bases, and their customer support would double and all that kind of stuff. Do we really have to do this? I mean, are we really at the end of the line? And all I wanted to do was find out what Bill Gates was going to do, and Andy Grove at Intel, because they were on Intel chips. And were they at the end of the line too, and they couldn't make them go any faster? They were at 66 megahertz, so maybe that had topped out. Because I was a physicist, I knew 66 megahertz was just unbelievable. How 66 million instructions, come on, how did they ever get it that fast? You can see why they can't cool it and can't get it to go any faster. So, but Steve was determined we were going to do this RISC chip thing. He wouldn't use the Spark chip because he didn't like Scott McNeely. That was some from Sun. And he liked George Fisher, and so he wanted to use that instead of a MIPS chip, and we were going to do this. And I was trying to point out all the problems with it, and Steve wouldn't hear it. So one day we were having a meeting. There were about 12 of us in the meeting, and Steve punctuated the air with his finger and said, "This company will live or die by the Motorola 88110 chip." And the room went quiet, and I don't know what possessed me. To this day, I can't believe this came out of my mouth. I said, "Die." It was the only word anybody uttered in that meeting. And Steve, nobody could believe I said it. And Steve stormed out of the meeting. And I think it was Ralph Derrickson who accompanied me back to my office and said, "It's been really nice working with you. And I'm sorry your career had to end on that." And I just thought it was so unfair because, there were signs that Apple was backing out, and so I went to my office and stewed in there and thought, you know what? I did it before with Ross Pro. I'm going to do it again with Andy Grove. It didn't work out so well with Ross, but whatever. So I called 1-800-ANDY Grove and got his assistant on the phone. Assistant meant a vice president in training, a very technical person who was training to be Andy Grove in the future. And the great guy. And I told him, "I'm going to get fired. Probably if you tell Steve this, I'm for sure getting fired, but I may get fired anyway. We have to do a processor switch. And I think, it seems to me that Intel, I want to know what you're doing, because they're saying we have to get away from complex instruction set chips, and everybody's going to have to do it, including Microsoft, and have to distribute all the extra disks for Windows." So they invited me down, and I got our chief architect, William Parkhurst, and we went down to Intel and sat with that assistant. And then Andy Grove danced in. He was so charismatic and salesman oriented, and I misinterpreted it to be slickster. George Fisher seemed like the genuine article, PhD in mathematics, and he wasn't such a slickster. But here was Andy Grove saying, "Oh no, we're not, there's plenty of headroom. We could go to 200 megahertz. In fact, I could see a future with 400 megahertz. And it's like, oh yeah, sure you can. Right, how are you going to do that? And is there some other concept, multiple cores, or what can you do to get this chip to go faster? Anyway, I told him Steve loved people who admired him, older men who were accomplished, who admired him, who could be his mentor. if you just admire him and call him and bring your experts, I think you could get his attention. So they let me know every meeting they had, and he'd bring up all these technical experts. And I told him, Steve's thinking about it for the port. Just give us your two best engineers. They got to be really good, and we'll hide you down in the basement. Steve came and got me and asked me to help oversee the project. And it's like, does he know? Does he know some of the shenanigans I play around here? I'm not doing it to undermine him. I'm doing it to try to help him. And the cause, am I going to get fired? And 6 months later, I had a black computer, an Intel-based computer sitting in my office, draped in black. It was a beige computer, but draped in black so nobody could see. But Steve was more bold about it. He just put one in his office that was beige. He was running at 66 megahertz, and it ran twice as fast as our 33 megahertz machines. And we had a port, you know, that went to Intel. We never made it one though, and we had to get out of hardware. And at that point, I decided, poor Steve, this just isn't working out at Next. The whole world knows that. And his other company, Pixar, that's not working out either, even though they did a nice, you know, they did some nice shorts that played in the theaters. One got an Academy Award or something, but you know what? Steve was always on me to incorporate Pixar's technology within a Next machine. And I would always say, yeah, but it's only for animators, you know. And so anyway, I got a call from General Magic, and that's where I went. General Magic was the hottest company in the day. I was employee number 22, and I got to be an evangelist again. But when I got there, because I'm foolish, I owned a technical bookstore in San Jose on the side. We invited Gil Amelio to speak, who was the CEO of Apple at the time. He had come from National Semiconductor. And John Markov was sitting beside me, the columnist for the New York Times. And he said, and Gil Amelio spoke for 30 minutes about his new book that was written to show how he saved Apple. And he opened it up to one question at the end. And that one question was asked by John Markov. And it is, why did you buy Next instead of buying like Jean-Louis Gasset's company, BOS, which also had a nice operating system? And Gil Amelio responded, well, that was a polarizing issue within Apple because a lot of people were afraid of Steve and they liked Jean-Louis Gasset. But we felt that Next Step already ran on Intel, and that was important to us, and that's why we made the decision. And I just froze. It's like, John Markov, I hope you heard that. Steve, you owe me something here. This is like, are you kidding me? That's why they bought Next. And we know what happened then. Steve went back to Apple and somehow changed the world and turned it into the world's most valuable company, a story that nobody could believe. And somewhere along the way, not too far into it, some engineer noticed that that OS 10, which was Next Step, they bought it for Next Step. OS 10 became the underpinnings for OS 10 with Apple's design guides on top of it, its user interface on top of it. And somebody noticed in there that it could run Intel architecture. And so that led to them adopting Intel architecture for their laptops. It was just amazing. So that's story number 2. Story number 3, when my wife's up there whispering time. So that company, General Magic, we decided we were going to build the iPhone 6. It was the greatest vision ever. Those were the drawings that you see. That's an iPhone 6 that we're holding up to the drawings. It was about the same dimensions. We had exactly the same vision. We had an app store in mind, the whole thing. And we had a lot of ex-Next people and Apple people there, some legendary Apple people there. And the devices looked like this. We couldn't quite achieve the reality of the vision in those days. We were ahead of our time. But it was battery operated. You had to plug it into a telephone line, except for the Motorola device, which had some wireless. This was the Sony device. And we were making the operating system that would power this whole line of handheld devices. If you could imagine such a thing, a handheld device that could send and receive messages anywhere and also keep your calendar, be your phone, and run applications. And I had an application that I thought was the most amazing from a third party. It was a mapping application. I don't know if you could get your head around this, but you plugged in a PCMCIA card in the side and you could bring up a map and you could get turn-by-turn instructions of where you wanted to go. You could search and you could look up something like, the Bay Bridge, and a map would come up showing your route and turn-by-turn instructions. I thought it was just a killer application. Surely somebody's going to, make some money off of that. And Steve came over, and I felt so sorry for him. He wanted to see what all the excitement was about after a couple of years when we finally had it ready. And and in the lobby, we gave him a device. Andy Hertzfeld gave him a device, and he went away and used it for 2 weeks. Steve was the kind of guy who really got into everything, every little nuance, every little pixel. He greatly admired the graphic designer on it, Susan Kerr, who was originally on the Macintosh and gave the smile to the Macintosh. And he seemed to really like it, but he came back and he gave us some feedback. Number one, the pen has got to go. It's stupid. Just use your finger. Number two, he doesn't want third-party applications on there. That's stupid. And so what Chris is doing is admirable. And, he keeps bugging me about this mapping app or something, but no, it's all got to be built in. There can't be an app store like you guys are planning. So we had some young engineers there who went different ways. One of them was Tony Fidel, and he went to Apple and helped them do an iPod. And then became in charge of the hardware team for the iPhone. We had another engineer who went to Danger, which got bought by Google, and did Android. So we couldn't make the General Magic device succeed because it was $800, the battery didn't last long, it was slow, we didn't have the technology and so on. We had a lot of cutesy stuff cool stuff that Susan Kerr designed. I didn't mean to demean it. I think it was the beginning of emoticons. We had something called a cloud. I think we named it that, where your messages would go up and float in the cloud and be stored there and then come back down. And 25 years later, after General Magic went out of business, some former Magic employees decided we should have a movie about it for all the people who went on and did these amazing things. And that in fact, we had the right idea, we were just too early. And so they did this documentary and they asked me to come over and be interviewed for the documentary. So I did, and I appeared in the film 3 or 4 times. And, but I never took it really seriously. I mean, who wanted to know about all these embarrassing experiences of failure 25 years ago? I mean, come on. But we did it. We did this film and we entered it in Tribeca and all the other film festivals and started winning these film festivals. And pretty soon big distributors picked it up. Sorry about the dog. Pretty soon big distributors picked it up and it got to be in-flight entertainment. It became the #1 documentary on the iTunes store for months. And this last February, I was in Morocco of all places and flying to Spain. And it was the in-flight only documentary that was in-flight entertainment there. It was bigger than Game Changers or anything else. And, Steve hardly made it, it was hardly mentioned in the film. And yet it became, I think, part of the inspiration for him to do that. So the last story that I wanted to wrap up with is Pixar was a long, hard battle, 20 years. Steve bought it from George Lucas. He'd invested $50 million into it. He told his accountant, don't let me spend any more money on Pixar. I can't do it. But Pixar had to get out of hardware, just like Next had to get out of hardware. That's, by the way, one of the reasons I felt so sorry for Steve in the lobby. He looked so sad because his lifetime dream of running a computer company was over. He would never be able to do that again because he had to get out of the hardware business at Next, and it became a software company. And he really liked the hardware, and everyone knew that he would never get to do hardware again. So so now he has Pixar, and Pixar had these nice short films, but the workstation sales weren't going well. The software sales weren't making money. And Steve wanted us to bundle RenderMan, the software that they used for animation, into Next Machine. And Next machines were already a peg. They used up too much memory. We had Adobe's Display PostScript in there that took up 1 megabyte of memory, which was a lot in a day. And RenderMan was going to take up a lot. And it's like, oh, how do we talk Steve out of this? We're all trying to talk him out of it. So eventually he caved and decided to try to sell it at CompUSA stores in a package for $495, and that didn't do so well either. But in the meantime, Steve came and got me one day and said, will you take this check up to Ed Catmull, who's the CEO of Pixar in San Leandro, so they can keep the doors open. I had to give bad news to Ed this morning to tell him to lay off half the staff. So they had 74 employees, and I told him to go down to 36, if I remember my numbers right. But he said, I told him to keep the creative team with John Lasseter. And it's like, oh, what's going on? And so I drove up there, and Ed was out in the parking lot helping half the company pack up their things and load them into, and sorry about the kid noises in the background too, if you can hear that. They've been laid off, and it was a sad day. They were loading things in the trunk of their cars. And so I gave Ed the check. I didn't believe that I thought my memory must be wrong, that Steve was writing checks to keep it open. But this book, which, oh, I cut off the author at the bottom. You guys know who he is, not Stephen Levy, but the other Levy. Anyway, this book verified that's what Steve was doing. He was writing checks, and they never knew if they were going to get their next check or not. So I give the check to Ed, and in the parking lot, we sit there and talk for as long as he could bear to talk. He was just this sad puppy, you know, with a long face and everything. It was just like one of the worst days of his life. And then he asked me a direct question, looked me in the eyes and said, is Steve trying to get a contract with Disney to do a movie? And I didn't know what I was allowed to say, or I didn't even know what I knew for sure. And I said, you know, Ed, he's had Jeff Katzenberg up a bunch of times in meetings, and he goes down to those meetings alone. And that might be what they're doing. I'm a little afraid of that. Is that exciting for you or not exciting? And he said, no, we can't do it. You have to tell Steve, we can't. It's impossible. That cannot be done. It's just no way, especially after laying off half the company. But even with the staff we had, it can't be done. It just can't. So you have to convince him to do an episode for the TV show, the Disney TV show, 24 minutes. We can do that, barely. It'll kill us, but we can do it. But no movie. You got to get to him and tell him no movie. And so I went back and tried to talk to Steve about it, but Steve didn't want to talk about it. And sure enough, they came up with this terrible contract, you know, for this movie where Pixar would never make enough money unless it was the all-time best-selling animated film ever. And animated films didn't sell that well. And Pixar didn't have the brand of Disney in any way. They found out the creatives didn't get along with Jeff Katzenberg, and it was a big mess. And that's about the time that I left. So that was depressing also. But here's a story that I'm taking a little bit of a risk. It's a short one. I'm taking a little bit of a risk in telling because I may get a few things wrong, because unlike the other ones where I was an absolute eyewitness to it, one of the few who saw it, this one I heard about from my friends like Mike Slade, who was my boss at Next. He was the VP of marketing, and has been written up in several of the books. And that is that Ed Catmull, who was such a reasonable guy and had Steve's ear, and Steve respected him. He was one of those older men who admired Steve and sort of mentored him, told him, Steve, you have to let go of, you know, you just have to let it go when somebody does something that offends you terribly, and they're going to do it. I remember when I mentioned that we had 8 other founders besides Steve of Next, all 8 of them left when I was there. And they left, you know, in very bitter ways. So to give you an example, Bud Tribble went to Sun. He cleaned out his office over the weekend. He went to Sun as a new VP of engineering. They issued a press release at 10 in the morning. And that's how I learned about it. And I think that's how Steve learned about it, because he came into my office and sat down on the floor and fought back tears for 5 minutes about Bud leaving. It just crushed him because Bud was his, I thought Bud was his closest, you know, guy, and was head of engineering, and, you know, had made Next Step what it was. And Ed said, you got to give that up, Steve. You have to move past it. Focus on the mission. Don't focus on personal grievance or personal ambition. Just do it because you love it. And you know you do. Stick with it because you love it, and do it for that reason. And so when my boss resigned, Mike Slade, Steve and Mike had gone back forever. As Mike had been at Microsoft and had overseen, he was the product manager for Excel, which got ported to the Macintosh. And Steve and Mike were very close. Mike would even put up with Steve's driving at 100 miles an hour down the 101, getting car sick and everything else without a driver's license and no license plates because they'd all been taken away. And after 2 years, when Steve wouldn't talk to Mike anymore because Mike wrote a resignation letter that mentioned the 3 things Steve needed to do to fix his life, Steve called him back and said, you know what, I reread the letter and you're right. And I think he did that because he got advice from Ed Catmull. And he got over it. And Mike joined him at Apple. And Mike was the one who advised the team and Steve to do the music player, the iPod, and stuck with him for a very long time. And Bud Tribble is back at Apple even today. Steve got over that. And I think, you know, we had a lot of bumps and bruises along the way, but my interpretation of history is that was a huge turning point for Steve, when he could forgive people, move past it, focus on what he loves to do, and get over whatever it was, a brick to the head or whatever. And so I'll close with that quote of his, which I try to keep in my mind all the time. My word of 2020 is resilience. 2020 is a hard year for most of us. And my word of the year is resilience. Sometimes life's going to hit you on the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. And I think that was the key to getting through to Steve and having him be the one person who stuck with it when the other 8 gave up and he had high turnover and a lot of us bailed to go to General Magic and people hit him in the head with bricks and all that kind of stuff. And he stuck with it all because of that. And that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was awesome. I'm seeing a lot of positive comments. I love it. People that have questions, how long can you be here, Chris?
As long as they want.
Okay. So here's what we're going to do. If people have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'm going to manage the questions and ask Chris so that we can get as many questions as possible going. So I'm going to keep going. So where do you see, one of the questions is, where do you see technology taking us in the future?
Where do I see technology? What, I'm sorry?
Taking us in the future. What do you see in the future, kind of at a summary level? What is your visionary side, futuristic side say?
Well, you know, I have trouble imagining it because for the same reason I couldn't imagine more than 66 megahertz, and now what are we at? Gigahertz, something with multiple cores. I'm just astonished at some of the things we've been able to do. I guess the thing that astonishes me the most and frightens Elon Musk the most is what Google's been able to do with AI. One of our guys from General Magic, an engineer, went to Google and became head of AI. And then last year he went to Apple and became head of AI there. You know, the search engine, when you consider how much content there is on the net, what YouTube recommends to you, you know, the AI seems to know you better than your wife knows you, or than you know yourself. It's just eerie that it can do what it does. So, you know, I think about that a lot. You mentioned cake. We're trying to have conversations more free of conspiracy theories and so on, and higher quality conversations. And the hardest thing is getting people the content in front of them that they're most interested in. And that's what YouTube does so well. I think 75% of the videos that are watched are from their recommendations. So I'm pretty obsessed with, you know, I can shout from here, hey, Google, and ask it questions and have it come up with astonishing answers and suggest music to me I didn't know I wanted to listen to. So I don't know where that goes, but holy crap, it's amazing.
Cool. So another question I have is, what kind of advice would you provide young professionals who have a fear of rejection?
Well, that plagues all of us all the time, right? It certainly has always plagued me. Some of these times when I've had to call Andy Grove or apply to Stanford or, leave a company, I think of Steve's quote about being foolish. And I think, oh, am I ever going to be able to do this? What if it doesn't work? It's so scary. And, but as somebody I worked with once told me, if you don't ask, you don't know. So maybe you ask 100 people and you get 99 rejections. You got to get used to that. You're going for the one. And you know what? Fortunately, I married Tony, and Tony is absolutely fearless. And I don't know how many times I've gone to promote something and I just didn't want to impose on somebody, or I didn't want to ask the question, or I was self-conscious, or I was fearing rejection or something like that. And Tony can see that in me. So she just struts right up to him and asks him. And, I've worked on it all my life, and I'm still not the best person to answer it because I've failed it that many times.
All right. Okay, I've got lots of questions coming in. What year was it that you talked to Andy Grove? People are asking that. You recall what year that came?
I would think it would have been 1992.
Okay.
By the way, I think they gave us a big contract. They paid a lot of money for the port. I don't think that's ever been disclosed, but it really, with each amount of funding that we got with Next, it was a miracle how Steve could talk people out of their money. If any one of those fundings had fallen through, I think the world would be a very different place, and if Andy hadn't put in the money that I think he put in, who knows, Next never would have been anything, and Steve never would have gone back to Apple.
I can tell you along the lines of one of your stories, Sunsoft, a subsidiary of Sun Microsystems, paid him $50 million to port Next Step to Sun's systems, even though he was not friendly with Steve Jobs. Scott McNeely was not friend. Steve Jobs was not friendly with Steve Jobs.
Wow, amazing.
Okay, next question. Have you talked to Bud Tribble in the last 20 years?
No, I haven't. And I've gone to various different Next reunions. And I actually had told that at one of the reunions, we must have had, I don't know, we had a lot of people there, I want to say 100 or something like that. And we were talking about, it was on the 20th anniversary, I think, of Apple buying Next. And so people got up and gave their stories of how it got bought. And I told my story of the Intel thing. No one had ever heard that at Next except for one or two William Parkers. And I hadn't heard the story that one of the engineers had called up Ellen, the VP of engineering at Apple, and said, hey, we got a good operating system for you, and I heard you're looking for it. And that got her talking to Gil Emilio, and that helped, make things happen too. But I haven't talked to Bud, and I would really like to. I feel a little bad because I wanted to be like I was at Stanford. I wanted to be the person who just loved every second of it. But there were a lot of things that were just really hard that weren't working at Next. And I had to be that guy who had or at least I thought I did, had to be that guy who would tell Bud and Steve, this isn't working. For example, the files we wrote on the disk were not interleaved. So the performance off a Mac for opening a 50 megabyte Photoshop file, it would open it in 10 seconds. And on our machine, it would take 2 minutes. And yet we were, marketing this to publishers. I had to go to Bud and say, this is crazy. We got to change the interleaving on the disk. And he said, well, it's not so easy. We don't control the virtual memory on Berkeley Unix, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, I'm getting off in the weeds.
All right, I've got another one that Irene's being persistent here. So she's wondering if the adversity in your early life had what you now would call PTSD, and how did you overcome that, and what was the most valuable lesson you think you learned through that journey?
So I was very, very lucky in meeting some of the people that I did. Tony, I don't know what I ever would have done without Tony, but the guy who was the camp director, who He was my all-time hero. I'd been at that camp for like 7 summers before Tony ever arrived as a camper, before I became a counselor. And that guy, you know, he didn't know anything about my background. He could probably tell something was wrong with me, and he just gave me all kinds of self-confidence. So I had all these people who kept giving me, you know, some confidence, and that was making a big difference. And I finally decided, you know what, I'm over it. And by the way, Tony's degree is in psychology. So I decided I'm over it, you know, it's no problem. And one day I was driving up with somebody, I think you know, Dennis Capavella, and to Alameda to visit another company. I was driving my car, and when we came out of Alameda, I missed the turn on to Highway 101 and ended up in East Oakland, in my old neighborhood, for the first time in I don't know how long. And as soon as I went onto the freeway, I thought, oh no, this is bad. And I could feel nausea coming on. And I thought, oh, come on, you're a grown man. This is crazy. This has been years since, oh, it's not a problem. And you should be fine. And I broke out into a sweat. You know, I was loosening my collar and my tie and was like hyperventilating. How could this be happening to me? I'm a grown man, well-adjusted. What's happening? I'm having a panic attack or something. And it's happened to me a couple more times. One, we had a patent lawsuit at SmugMug, and I was going to have to make a court appearance in Oakland. And it's like, and actually there was a friend of mine that I was supposed to appear on his behalf in Oakland, and I just couldn't bring myself to go to court. We finally made arrangements for Dawn to do it. And it's like, okay, something's wrong with me psychologically, because I still can't do Shakespeare. I just can't.
All right. So how do you explain that your acceptance at Stanford, based on your story and your concerns? How do you think that happened? What convinced them that you were the right person to be at Stanford?
I've wondered that all my life. And because I felt like I had a serious imposter syndrome when I started there. I just couldn't believe, you know, that they would accept me. But I was good at math and science for whatever reason. I think Mr. Davis, you know, getting me interested in it as a, you know, freshman in high school was the one thing I could do. It was the first thing I could do besides sports. It was the first thing I could really do. And we had in the county, we had some county assessment tests. And at the end of the year when I was a freshman, and I scored 6th in the county among all the students who took the test, including seniors, in the math portion of the test. I didn't know how I did it. I didn't know the answer to a lot of the questions, and I got called in by the principal for cheating. And I remember crying and swearing I didn't cheat and everything else. And I finally had to persuade him, give me a math test and I'll show you I didn't cheat. But that always hurt, you know, that they thought I was cheating. I just, sort of like a juvenile hall, they thought I was a criminal because I was shoplifting. It hurt, you know, even though I was. And so I really aced a lot of my classes. And I part of it was making up for how bad I was in English, history, writing, reading comprehension, anything that had to do with an English sentence, I couldn't do. So I just overcompensated in the sciences, and so I really had good achievement test scores, and I really had good recommendations from my professors at the University of Utah, and I took all the hardest math classes, complex variables, and all that kind of stuff. So I guess that was it.
Well, you're a great writer now, as far as I think most people are concerned. So I commend you with that.
Yeah, and Tony's up there saying, and your wife helped you with English. That's for sure.
Well, she did a great job of that.
Yeah, they're saying you did a great job with that, Tony. So there were times when I was at Next, Steve would ask me to write some things. He was a great writer and great storyteller. By the way, I forgot this in my talk. I helped him with his initial keynotes, but then Wayne Goodrich helped him after that and did 113 of them or something, including the iPhone intro and the iPad intro and all that. He was at Next. He was a system engineer at Next. We knew each other really well. And I interviewed him on Cake, and I asked him that question: did Pixar have any influence on how Steve got to be a good storyteller? And he said, absolutely. The story creation process at Pixar heavily influenced Steve. And he became a much better storyteller than he even was, given his Pixar background. So given that, how good he was at all that, whenever he would ask me to write, I think, oh my gosh, you don't know who you're asking to write this. If you had any idea, you wouldn't ask me to write it. So I would struggle with it. I didn't want to let him down, and I would overcompensate because, you know, this background of, you know, feeling inadequate, like an imposter. I'd work 5 times as hard on it as anybody else would to get to write him something he would like.
Cool. And so how did you end up starting Smug Mug with Don? People are interested.
Yeah, so that's pretty interesting. Don, when he was 17, he was always a geeky kid, and moving out in Silicon Valley was perfect for him. And he was, you know, the expert geek at Mountain View High School. His mother took him to the first internet provider. What was that called, Tony? Best Internet on Castro Street, Mountain View. And he wanted to apply for a job, and he took a computer motherboard that he'd helped assemble as part of his job application. He could get paid $7 an hour there. And they had 4 employees. And when he walked in, they hired him. And they told him to start screwing those modems on the 4x8 plywood boards that covered the walls, so more people could dial in and get internet connection. And he became head of, over the next few years, he became head of their networking there, and arranged to have all these optical fiber trunks come in, and they did a co-hosting thing. And at FatBrain, I ended up co-hosting our servers at Best Internet under Don's, you know, thing. And I Tony loaned him some money, which turned into a fair amount of money for him to go start companies. And he had a couple of false starts, and then he landed on Smug Mug. And the idea at the time was it was going to be online gaming, a community for online gaming. And we were going to license id's engine, the engine that was used for Quake. We were going to license the Quake 3 engine. And we were going to build a gaming site around that. And it was what he loved to do. And he knew the people at id really well. So, but I couldn't see how to make money with that. And it was 2002, and I never thought we would get funded for it. And the venture capitalists weren't funding game companies and so on. But he had a part of what he'd written as part of the community, photo gallery software. And I said, hey, Don, what if we were just be able to pull out that beautiful piece? You've done a beautiful job on it. And monetize that, because my motorcycle forum, Adventure Rider, everybody wants to know where to put their photos, and there's only Shutterfly and OPhoto, and they want to sell you prints, and they don't let you link them and all that kind of stuff. So he agreed, and we just decided to do it as a photo gallery thing, and maybe he'd come back to gaming in the future. And it took off. I funded it. It was right here in the house, and for 4 years, and we just bootstrapped it. And Don did most of the engineering single-handedly. He was amazing. You know, it was just, he could do everything from the ops to the user interface.
Awesome, awesome. So another question is, how did you feel when, you know, you knew the kind of traction Next was having, you knew what kind of volume they were having on computers and sales? How did you feel about, I mean, your job, you were doing developer relations, and you need to sell them on the idea of having lots of users. Developers don't want to be porting to a system that's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
How did you feel with that?
Well, we had that was the constant struggle. We had a really tough time with that. Bill Gates would come down every year, and he would say, Steve, as soon as you can give me 1 million machines as a target to sell to, I'll port Microsoft Office over to it. I love what you've done. Technically, it's beautiful as usual. You're promoting it. You're the only man in the world who could promote a black and white education machine like this and get attention for it. And but you got to give me 1 million machines a year. So we just couldn't get anywhere with him. His friend Larry Ellison did port Oracle over, and so we ended up having higher priced software that we could sell to financial institutions, JP Morgan and trading floors and things like that. And we had a really easy database builder. We had an interface builder at the time that we thought was revolutionary, and object-oriented programming and all that kind of stuff. So, so we just concentrated on those. Steve never lost his dream to have it be a broadly available consumer computer. And so I had to keep trying to get consumer software, but it wasn't working. There's one funny story about that. A guy from a research institute, just one of the many guys to visit, was impressed with the machine. His name was Tim Berners-Lee, and he'd written something called, an Internet Explorer. And so it looked like Microsoft Word. And I was trying to make sense of it. So it's got nice fonts, and it's got these blue links, and you click on these links, and Tim would say, so now the next page you see is being served up by a different computer. And I was thinking, and so what? I mean, what's the point? Why would you want that? And so being afraid that I was missing something, because I was well aware from talking to Guy Kawasaki, who had become a friend, that you never know what's going to hit. And some of the things are not the things you expect. They had that experience with the Macintosh and oldest PageMaker. They didn't recognize as valuable and would only meet with Tim Brainerd I think his name was in the lobby. And so if I remember right, I took Tim Berners-Lee up to meet Steve in his office and had him demo it for 5 minutes to Steve. Steve was always very twitchy, couldn't sit for long. And he looked at me with that tense stare and beady eyes and said, "Is this cool?" And that was code for, "I don't get it. Just get this guy out of my office." We just didn't get it. It wasn't until Mark Andreessen did Mosaic that we got it. And we just didn't have the economics for consumer software. We had to fill in all the, one of our developers was Jonathan Schwartz, Lighthouse. He became president of Sun. And he and Steve were so angry with each other, they couldn't speak to each other. So Steve would tell me what he wanted to tell Jonathan. We had to have Jonathan. He wrote some software we just had to have. And then I would have to go up to Burlingame to Jonathan's office and tell Jonathan what Steve had said, but reworded. And then Jonathan would lose his mind and tell me all the things he was going to tell Steve. And I'll tell him. And I'd go back and tell Steve, reworded, because the two couldn't even speak to each other. But Jonathan, he charged high prices for his software, and he managed to make money that way. It's a small company, but he made money.
Well, it's amazing, if you look at Steve before, at Apple in the first round, and then going back to Apple. I mean, he understood the consumer market better than anyone, right?
We didn't think so when he was in his 30s. I thought that when he was in his 20s, he represented this up and coming generation. But once he became rich, he became a billionaire and all that kind of stuff, he couldn't understand the rest of us. And that's why the machine cost $8,000, and why people they didn't have DSL lines, and they weren't going to put up with magneto-optical drives, which were expensive. And, I thought he'd lost it, and that, the only hope was to go sell to corporations. But when we did focus groups for the corporations, they all said, they're not buying from a guy like that. That's like buying a car from John DeLorean. He's a drug runner, and you don't know how long he's going to be around. That's what they would say. And Steve would be behind the one-way glass and fall over backwards and drive a stake through his heart after he'd hear a comment like that.
Mm-hmm. Here's an interesting question. Do you remember Project Gutenberg and seeing Alice in Wonderland with the typography the very first time?
Yeah, I did, and we talked about it a lot. Steve was so into typography; he just loved it. It just came naturally to him. He loved design, and he was crazy about that kind of stuff. So, but I never really, there were a few things. We had a team of 6 evangelists, and I led the team for quite a while, and Steve kept me so busy, and we had different evangelists for different products. So like one evangelist advocate looked over Mathematica. That was a volatile developer. He's since done really well and become very famous. But I didn't get closely involved in Project Gutenberg, no.
Okay. And what advice would you collectively give to the next generation to help them succeed? And what would success look like? You know, you look at all the what's happening, the pandemic, the spectrum of politics, the bottled up anger. What's your take on all this, and what advice can you give the next generation?
So my number one advice would be to go watch Steve's commencement speech at Stanford. I can't believe they asked him to give that as a non-college graduate. And I can't believe he agreed to do it. And I can't believe how he prepared it to the last minute, scribbling and everything. It's a funny story. And I couldn't watch it for a while because I thought, yeah, he's just going to make a lot of crap up. I've heard too much of his spin before. But it was a heartfelt talk. It was a great talk, and you know, it was really amazing. But I will tell you one thing that does scare me, and that is in 1991, when we were talking about opening up the internet, 90, 91, 89, talking about opening up the internet and making it public and accessible to everybody, not just scientists and so on. I'd been using forms of it for 10 years as earth scientist. I thought it was the greatest thing ever. This was going to spread truth and light and, you know, accessible information. People are going to be able to read science papers, you know, the whole thing. And so I fought hard for it. And I had a dinner with Bjorn Strustrup. He wrote the C++ language, and he was beside himself that we didn't choose C++ language, unlike Bill Gates, to go inside Next Machines. We chose Objective-C, and we did it. It was kind of rash the way we did it and everything. So he was lecturing me. And, and somehow we got off on forums and the internet. And he said then what I've never forgotten, and it turned out to be right, which is just look at the way forums start. A group of very interested people get together, and they're knowledgeable, and they're going to speak with respect to each other and have open debate and hear each other's sides and all that kind of stuff. And what's going to happen is people are going to come along later who don't respect them and have a different agenda, and they're going to start trolling them. And the original founders are going to drift away, and then it's going to become much less than it was before. So, you know, when my mom was on the streets of Oakland and I was listening to all her conspiracy theories, what she believed was plausible for the most part. I mean, possibly, you know, the Russians were bugging our telephone lines, you know, and mostly what I was hearing from the other homeless people were, I thought they were mainly plausible things. Now, but if somebody said something like that, like my mom would say, we would say, well, they're mentally ill. They need to go to the psych ward. Now, it just seems like what's coming out of Facebook groups and encrypted messages and so on are things like demon sex, you know, and casting out demons to heal COVID-19 and anti-mask hysteria and so on. And it just seems like the internet has gone the way Bjorn Strustrup suggested it would. Because if you're a scientist like me and you want to go into one of these forums and defend, like, you know, global warming or something like that, you ain't going to last long. There are no scientists in there. And Facebook groups, we all get chased away fast. And it becomes this private, closed off group. And, you know, because I'm fascinated with it, and I've been involved in a few, like a thriving anti-vaccination group on Facebook. And I don't mention that I'm pro-vaccination in there, for heaven's sakes, or I wouldn't be in the group. So I just watch what they say, and it's like Bill Gates is implanting chips, and you know, his vaccines are, you know, a form of population control and all that kind of stuff. It's like, what? You know, it's just, I don't know. It's beyond me. So one of the reasons I bring it up is Stephen Levy, who I knew in the day very well, still talk to him. He was always covering Steve and Next and Apple and everything else. He writes for Wired Magazine now. He just wrote an interview with Bill Gates in Wired Magazine that's really worth reading, where Bill bemoans the fact that the three areas he's most interested in, global warming, GMOs, and vaccines, are the most active with science deniers and accusing him of all these crazy things. And it's the first time I've seen Bill publicly, not just in private, vent about the current state of politics and how the testing is total crap and all that kind of stuff. And yet he has to endure the death threats and everything else that Anthony Fauci has to endure. And he's got a lot to offer. You know, I was on the phone with him many times with Steve Jobs, and dude is extremely, as you know, he's the genuine article. And the way we treat him is, I just can't believe it's happening.
So what was your most important lesson learned from your relationship with Steve Jobs?
Perseverance.
Perseverance.
Nobody would have stuck with Pixar like he did. Nobody would have stuck with Next like he did. I wondered the whole time when he would go away, you know, to Italy for a week, to just be in the Uffizi for a week. And he would come back and he would seem more relaxed. And I knew his state of mind when he left was bad. I just thought, why does he do this? You know, the Mercury News was all over writing negative articles about him. And, you know, he doesn't need to do this. He's worth $200 million, you know. Why? Everybody else has given up on it. Why can't Steve give it up? And he said, you know, to really be a great entrepreneur and do something great, you have to stick with it to the point where it just seems everybody thinks you're nuts. And he did. And, you know, resilience and perseverance, that guy had it. And looking around at the ones who are really changing the world now, Elon Musk, you want to talk about resilience and perseverance. Why does he do that? He's worth $200 million or something from his PayPal earnings. Why does he drive himself this hard? Jeff Bezos, you know, I knew him for a long time, and they were on the edge for so long. People thought it was Amazon.toast, but perseverance. These guys, somehow they persevere when the rest of us wouldn't.
Okay, next thing is, what are your thoughts about Apple's current recently announced at the developer conference of changing to internal chip development and away from Intel?
You know, I'm not sure how qualified I am to answer that, but they've had some pretty good success with chips in the past. And, you know, Steve was always, he always had the philosophy of, in order to do it right, you had to do it yourself. You had to control everything. You can't depend on third parties.
Yep. I
thought it was interesting that Tim Cook changed that a little bit when they started outsourcing manufacturing to China. And I guess I'm not surprised to see Apple do it. And, you know, a lot of people tuned in this broadcast would be more of authority on than I am on, you know, how they're doing with their chips, but I understand they're doing pretty doggone well. So, you know, there was when Amazon came out with AWS, my son Don was one of the first ones to adopt it. I think we were company number 3, and Amazon was desperate to get somebody to adopt it. And Jeff Bezos put him on the advisory board. Don looks like Jeff. They can be mistaken for each other. And Don, I think Don's been on their advisory board ever since. So when they were going to promote AWS, they had a reporter from U.S. News and World Report call me, and he was going to write a cover story on why the heck a retailer is doing AWS. And I kept repeating to the reporter, you know, it doesn't make sense for a retailer to do that. I know, but they're good at it. I mean, we use them and they're just amazing at it. I don't know how they got that good at it, but they're just so good at it. I think his name was Ron Egan. And I said, you wrote the cover story about Steve shouldn't do stores either. And I would have agreed with you, and in fact I did for a long time. But who knew that Steve could be that good at retail stores? How did he get that good at it? I mean, they're amazing stores. How did Jeff and his team get that good at doing AWS? I have no idea. So, you know, if Apple's great at chips, one more arrow in their quiver.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Cool. And so here's another interesting question I think that really you would resonate with is, do you have any thoughts on how to help the kids in areas like East Oakland move forward? Any kind of, I mean, you lived it yourself, you were there, you see the poverty, the racism, the imbalance. Any ideas on that?
You know, to me, it all comes down to inequality. I have I'm not an economist, and I just have a very simple notion of the economy, but I get in, my bias is confirmed by some economists who also put forth this theory that the rich, it's the golden rule. The people with the gold make all the rules in the government and have the money for the lobbying and everything else. And they just do it in favor of extracting the most money that they can and getting richer and richer. And service workers and teachers and nurses get poorer and poorer. And then we don't have the money to buy the stuff the rich people are selling. And the economy starts circling the drain. And it just feels to me like, every move to give tax breaks to the rich, every move to, to make it harder and harder and harder, for people to get a living wage, is killing us. And look at the explosion of homeless people we're getting because they can no longer afford their rents, whereas rich people are building penthouses. To me, there's something wrong with that.
How do you, here's another question. How do you feel when other people tell you about their childhoods? Interesting question.
The funniest thing is I thought I was the unluckiest boy in the world. I was sure of it. I'd never met anybody else like me. By the way, shout out to the Catholic Church. I'm not Catholic, but the nuns and the fathers, priests and things were so good to us. They were in the poor areas, soup kitchens on Thanksgiving and everything else. Anyway, I thought I was the unluckiest boy in the world. And then I grew up and learned about places like India and saw some of the movies and documentaries. And I started volunteering for the Ronald McDonald House as a photographer to document the plight of those kids with cancer. And then I felt ashamed of myself for ever thinking I was the most unlucky, kid in the world. So, I love to hear the stories of other kids. We try to help where we can. It can be a little bit, depressing and soul destroying because I think my daughter's on this line and, she doesn't promote herself on this, but she lives in Oregon and social services are always calling her and they'll have a 17-year-old girl who's pregnant or something and needs a place to live and my daughter will take them in. Or they'll have a recently divorced mom who has 3 kids and needs to get back on her feet and get a job. And so Annie will take care of their kids for a while. And I watch that and think, boy, there go some angels. I wish I was that good. Especially considering how I grew up, you'd think I'd be in Oakland every day helping those kids.
Here's one that's I think you'll like. Can you elaborate on I think you've already done this quite a bit, but can you elaborate on the impact of your wife? And does your wife give talks on how to turn failure to launch into success? Tony, you hear me?
Hey, Tony.
Yes.
Can you come down here for a sec? I'm going to take off.
What?
I'm going to take off. Unplug my earpods. Can you still hear me? Some on the laptop microphone now.
Tony, here's a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, she's coming down the stairs.
Okay. Tony, Andrew here. Here's a question we got from the audience. Can you elaborate? We want Chris to elaborate on the impact of you, Tony. And they also want to know if you give talks on how to turn failure into launch into success.
Love. That's all it was, just love. I'd already graduated from college, didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew I wanted to get married sometime, fall in love and get married. And when I first met Chris, it was love at first sight for both of us. And once he found out I had already graduated with honors from college and that I wanted to marry him,
That was a shock. By the way.
It was a shock, but it was motivation too. I mean, I think he said, well, maybe I better do something about that.
Shape up.
Shape up.
So, and how many years have you been married now?
What are we up to? 40? We got married in 74. So we're
Been a while.
46. 46 years.
Yeah.
Wow, congratulations. Congratulations.
Yep, thank you. So I wish I had a magic formula that I could give you, but it's mainly just love and support. If you love somebody, it's easy to support them. And because I'd already been through college and I did very well in English, it was easy for me to help him with grammar and spelling and that sort of thing.
She still does it.
Yeah, I still do. So that part was pretty easy, and he was very anxious to turn his life around. He really wanted to do well and to graduate from college. So he was motivated, and I was able to help.
Well, you've done a great job. From my own personal experience.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
Still works at SmugMug. She's the Countess of Cash.
Yes. So here's another question. Chris asked if you have heard of, there's this African-American photographer named Charles Teeny Harris.
I don't know the name. Sounds like I should know the name. I would love to hear more.
Okay.
I'm totally into photography, and so the reason the table is rattling is we have a dog here who's
Nudging me.
whenever we get together, he wants to get in the middle.
He does give a link to the website link.
Yeah, I have that.
Very nice.
Oh yeah, are you familiar with the work of this great Black photographer?
If you do that, can you get back?
Yeah, I
Okay.
can get back. Pennsylvania
Pennsylvania
Heritage.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, Teeny Harris. Yeah. Well, I would like to say I know him. It sounds like I absolutely should.
Yeah. Well, you will now, right?
I will now. I've got some reading to do. Why do I not know? So
I'll throw another question for you, and we'll start closing it out. What was your last? I mean, you're an adventurist. You're always going all around the world. You take your motorcycle everywhere. You've told me of several of your accidents and different adventures.
had a few more since then.
Yeah.
So what was your last adventure, and what's your next?
So two quick ones, and then I'll tell you the next. The first one was I was in Morocco. So I have this big motorcycle forum that gets almost 3 million visitors a month. Don't ask me how it got to be big like that, but we have 12 writers and an editorial director and the whole thing. And Triumph was coming out with a new motorcycle. They're so sexy. That's what Steve McQueen rode in The Great Escape. And to a motorcyclist, it's like, a Triumph. Oh. So they flew me over to Morocco for the launch of this bike. And then they had some of the world's best riders there. The world enduro champion, stunt riders. For this new film, this Bond film, No Time to Die, they did a 90-foot jump on one of these Triumphs onto a flat landing. It's like, oh my gosh. And the guy was there to lead the rides. And the stunt director, who had been in Bond films and Indiana Jones, he'd been, Laura Croft, he'd lost weight and put on prosthetics and a wig and all that kind of stuff. He was there, and for 4 days, we just went out riding in the dirt. We did all kinds of things in Morocco, and I was just thinking, dude, A, I'm old, and B, these are some of the best riders I've ever seen, and I'm trying to keep up with them, and it's like, this might not end well, but I made it home safely. And then my daughter, that was adventure number one. My daughter, Annie, once a year takes her kids to some country, and last year it was Costa Rica. So end of February to middle March, when COVID was starting to rage, we went to Costa Rica for a month and with the kids and did everything. We just had the greatest time. It's a good place. And during COVID, if you're going to have a pandemic, Costa Rica is a pretty good place to be.
Did you go east or west, Costa Rica?
What's that?
Was it east or west?
We went to a different, it's a narrow country. We went to a different place every week.
Cool, like Tamarin, Jaco, Manuel Antonio.
if my daughter is on the line, she can.
She's telling you,
I
right?
took the photos and did the driving and jumped off the bridges and swam in the rivers. And
I agree with you. Costa Rica's a great place to go anytime, actually, anytime.
yeah, so wonderful. I don't know. Next year, maybe Thailand.
And then what's your next one? You've got, where are you going?
So that's a good question. I think the next adventure will be wherever Annie chooses to go. And I think she's inclined towards Thailand.
Well, honey, we were not invited to the Thailand planning. We were going to babysit.
For that one, but when she takes her kids.
We have to plan one where we're going to go to. So we'll see.
But when she takes her kids, so I have a 50K run coming up in the Santa Cruz Mountains that's what the bad thing about my son-in-law is. He's a doctor and he says, you got to get in shape. You're coming with me on a 50K run. It's like, oh, I hurt. I'm old.
Okay, here's another one. Speaking of AI and motorcycles, have you heard or seen the robot that rides and races motorcycles? Ended up saying racing against Valentino Rossi. The robot's name is Motobot. That might be a good interview for one of your.
Yeah, it sounds like it'd be a great interview. Valentino is one of the true greats in the motorcycle industry.
Wow.
Sounds like Eddie Fisher playing chess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That would be amazing. So I want to know everything about that. I need a link.
We just had a good time on an electric motorcycle.
Yeah, I'm about to post that on YouTube. I just did a big review. I'm a YouTuber now. It's kind of the test. There's Scotts Valley.
Was it the Zero?
Yeah, the Zero.
Yeah.
Yep.
Zero Black Forest.
Yeah.
And they're in Scotts Valley. They dropped it off here and they gave it to me for 2 months. It's nice having 3 million visitors a month or whatever we have because all the motorcycle manufacturers want to get you their bikes to review. And I love photography and cameras and everything else. And it's a great bike. And the two of us love to ride. Tony rides too. And so we went up to San Francisco and down to the beaches and through the forests. And I took it dirt riding at a motorcycle park.
Wow. It's good to hear that they're still in business. I mean, because they've been in business at least 10 to 15 years, if not more.
Yeah, and they got a really good CEO, Sam Paschal, and he's been CEO there for about 4 years. They've taken $250 million worth of private equity to make that go.
Wow. And I'm going to close it off on this one. What is the one thing that you have not done that you want to do to close out your bucket list?
Well, that's kind of a funny thing. When I left Earth Science, I had great mission and purpose in Earth Science, because of the environment and being in the computer industry and making the stuff that goes into the landfill and the groundwater and everything else that we don't really want to think about that doesn't recycle very well and is sort of bothered me a little bit. My family is very prone to heart disease. My sister died of a heart attack, and so did my father. So I got about 20 years ago, the two of us got quite into eating whole plants. And it's good for health. It's good for the environment. It's probably the biggest thing any of us could do for the environment. It's good for halting the spread of
disease,
infectious disease, pandemics. There's kind of a moral thing with the animals, not kind of.
Being kind to the animals instead of killing them.
So it's spread to about 30 friends and family that we have. My daughter has a blog on raising a family. Her husband's a doctor and his practice is based partly on that. Raising a family of 5 kids to love eating whole plants. How do you do that? And so she has this wonderful blog on it. So I'm starting this YouTube channel, Plant Chompers. I've recorded my first episode, but haven't published it yet. And I really get into stories. There's one story in particular. I was a caddy for Jack LaLanne when I was a kid, and his mother was Seventh-day Adventist. They're mostly vegetarian. Some of them are vegans, and they're the longest lived population in the world. And Jack became this celebrity Hollywood star, ran an exercise program for 34 years in this model of great health. He wasn't totally vegan, but he ate a little chicken and fish. But boy, did he go for the fruits and the vegetables. And so I tell stories about him and everything else. And that's sort of what I want to do when I grow up, is be a YouTuber. That doesn't seem like something you can age out of. If you age with good health, you can still motorcycle and run 50 Ks and everything else, and you're eating a plant-based diet. Well, maybe you can spread it to other people without it being so awkward among your friends, because some of your friends don't want to hear about it.
We've had some success where we feel like we've actually saved people's lives, and
Completely.
we feel like, you know, if we can do anything to help that helps the environment and is good for animals and saves people's lives and makes families happier, then that's a pretty good goal.
So
I've got Tony to help me get the stories as I write them.
So you're growing up, you're ready to grow up, and you're growing up is to share your knowledge and help other people grow up with you.
Yeah. You know, earth science is a depressing place to be. It's hard to say that, but you know, if you knew what goes on, I mean, consumers know something about carbon in the atmosphere. That's just a tiny tip of the iceberg. You know, the chicken farms in the Appalachian watershed that are draining into Chesapeake Bay, all the manure, you know, that no one knows how to handle from those chicken farms that are full of antibiotics, and you know, it's unconceivable. I just don't, if you're in earth science, you just feel like you want to slit your wrists or something. But there is something we can do, and that's eat the plants.
Mm-hmm. So feedtheplants.com is what I think your daughter's saying. And she did say that Thailand 2021 is a yes, and you are both invited. All right.
Oh, that's good.
Thank you so much.
AMAC bean, yeah, any bean.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks for coming in, Tony. It was such a pleasure to have you. It was a great talk, and I'm going to transition it over to everybody. Let's give a virtual thank you to Chris.
Thank you.
I'm going to transition the closing over to Tanya. She's going to close out some logistics, and then we're going to close out for the night. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it. Tanya, go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tony. Nice to meet you as well. One of the things that I forgot, and I apologize to everyone, that we forgot to do in the beginning is give an opportunity. If you had an announcement for a job, or if you're in transition and would like to make that announcement, please raise your hand. Click on the yes button, and I will unmute you, and you can do so now.
The yes button is in the participants.
At the bottom. Okay, Gabriel, I will unmute you. No, maybe Andrew or Peter, can you unmute Gabriel?
Okay. Yeah, I just did.
Gabriel?
Hey guys, yeah, sorry, no, I was actually clapping. I didn't know that was raising the hand. Apologize.
Okay.
I was just
right.
thanking Chris for a wonderful talk. Apologize. Thank you,
No
Chris.
problem.
Here's
John?
John.
Me?
Yes.
Hi.
Go ahead.
That was such a wonderful presentation and stories. Thank you so much, Chris. That was just wonderful to hear. I'm in transition. I founded a technical education program for at-risk teenagers, but it's difficult to do that kind of work without a little bit of income. I'm a programmer by trade, so I am looking for some part-time opportunities doing programming.
Great, thank you, John.
Go
ahead and if you put, thank you. Go ahead and put your information in the chat as well. And then once we publish it, that'll be available, it'll be recorded. Thank you. Okay, Barry?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, unfortunately, Google decided to start zapping people from COVID. So my contract got cut yesterday. I've been doing really well with the Android site reliability lab since the beginning of the year, but they just called a few of us like, hey, we're out cold right now. So I just got cut. So, yeah, you know, we tech support, IT, network management, customer facing customer-facing, contentious support situations, and that kind of work. Anyway, that's kind of what I'm looking for, and pretty aggressively looking quickly in a very thin job market right now.
Yeah.
And on the good side, all the work at Google, I pretty much got out of debt from what the startup thing ran me into. So that was great to get that all paid off. But I expected that the Google income would continue, which it is not going to be.
I'm sorry.
So,
Yeah.
Anyway.
Go ahead and put your contact info in the chat, and we'll save that. Thank you.
I just got a comment
Right,
to John. I've been, just by coincidence, I've watched the 2 Steve Jobs movies, and just neat, hearing a live person in some of the stories that the movies don't cover. The Ross Perot aspect, especially.
Yeah, so I'm very familiar with a lot of the people that are, that have been profiled in those movies. Joanna Hoffman, who is amazing. She was one of the reasons I thought maybe I could get hired, because she had a PhD in in Middle East archaeology from the Oriental Institute. She'd been planning to do her field studies in Iran, and then it got overthrown. She's Jewish, she's short, and it's like, really? Because where are you going to do Middle East archaeology? So she came out to California and attended a talk that Apple gave at Park, and she asked the best questions. They were so impressed with her, they hired her and made her the product manager of the Mac.
That's
and
awesome.
She was my boss at General Magic, and she is one feisty woman, I'll tell you. So talented. So I don't know how many languages she speaks. She writes so well. She's amazing. But Steve would hire people who had these different backgrounds, and I think kind of on purpose, because he thought a melting pot was the right thing to do. And she was exhibit A for me, of somebody who came from a completely different background but thrived in her job.
That's unusual and exceptional in today's hiring market.
Yeah.
Very cool. No, thank you again. This was really neat.
Thank you, Barry. Galina?
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Chris, thank you so very much for sharing your story, especially the backstory. It's inspiring for all of us. Transitioning to Tanya, to your question, I am currently with Google, kind of also in the contract, looking for, on the one hand, looking for potentially chief of staff roles. Found a couple at Apple, applied for, so fingers crossed. But I'm also very passionate about education and kind of learning and development, and especially in terms of learning and helping others learn. So anything along those lines will be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Galina. And again, put your contact information, and we'll share that as well. If anyone has.
By the way, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but with regard to the movies, I forgot to say one thing. Andy and Joanna felt the movies were quite fictionalized, that they were taking liberties to make them succeed at the box office.
Cecilia, I think you wanted to make an announcement as well. I don't see your hand up, but you're welcome to unmute. Okay. Anyone else? John, you did. Okay. Anyone else that has any announcements? No.
Tanya, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hey, Tanya. Chris,
Hi.
first of all, thank you so much. It was amazing story. And I didn't know any of the backstory of your background and history other than your work with SmugMug. So that was fascinating and impressive. For people who are looking, we are hiring. We have 5 recs open right now, and we'll be opening more recs soon. So I'll post in the chat for the link. We're looking for a data engineer, a security engineer, creative director, and other various roles. So would love to have you guys apply.
Say what company.
It's Backblaze. So we do cloud storage and cloud backup.
Awesome.
Thank you, Gleb.
Thank you, Gleb. All right.
Yeah, thank
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you so much Chris, I lost your view.
Yeah, he's there.
Ah, there you are.
I was just
Chris,
reading the
again,
chat.
thank you. Yes, thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for moderating. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We will see you in September. Have a good evening and have a good rest of the week. Thank you.
Thanks again, Chris.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank
That was
you.
an honor.
All right. Take care, everybody. Thanks for
Please
coming.
Thank you.
Please don't cut this off till I can copy the link off of the chat, okay?
Sure. I'll paste it. We will paste the information in Facebook and LinkedIn, Barry, don't worry.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. See you later.